Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Fanfic Reread Project. In this episode, we are continuing our reread of Prophs 1.0 with, there aren't really designated sections of this. So the next chapter we are going to read is a Bran chapter. The next few chapters all come from the same draft and concern a very similar plot element, so that's kind of how they're all connected. So let's jump right into it. You have to come out of your room, Bran. His mother spoke to him from in front of the door. He didn't want to go wherever she was trying to get him to go. He didn't want to go anywhere at all. He wanted to stay in his room in the tower where nothing might happen to him. That's what he told his mother more than once by now, but she insisted. One day you will be a lord all your own like your father. Do you think you can do that by staying in your room all the time? Maybe, he said back. I'll be a lord. Can't I do whatever I want? Not stuck inside a tower, you can't. Now get up. Your brother wants you to ride with them. So 2 notes. Number 1, we stand a comedian. Number 2, once again, I am translating the names of the characters here so that they are the original names from A Song of Ice and Fire, but in Profs, these names are in Elvish. I just want you guys to know that, because even though I have trouble pronouncing these names, knowing what language they're in is kind of important for marking which version of Profs this is. But let's keep going. He was outside in half an hour. Clouds covered the sky, but they were thin and let in the sun's light easily. When he stepped from the castle, Theon said he looked like a man stepping from his jail cell, seeing the sun for the first time in years. He agreed. He was still squinting against the brightness when they passed the gates. He wasn't the only one, however. John was grimacing at the sun's light as well. He rode a real horse today. His brother said he would have to learn someday, and 10 was old enough. He thought he sounded like their father when he said that. A boy of 10, a voice echoed in the back of his head. His stomach went queasy, and the scar on his chin began to burn, though it had healed in the week since he got it. He took a breath to calm himself. Don't show it, he told himself. Don't make the mask. Their group was very small, smaller than he was accustomed to. It was just him, both of his brothers, Theon, all their wolves, and Harwin, since his mother insisted. Yeah, that name there. I'm not entirely sure which one. This is also a problem with the fact that I haven't read the first book in a while, so I don't remember if Harwin had anything to do with the horses or not. I know his dad did, and I think his name was like Hullen. Then again, I don't remember if I don't think either of them were technically in Winterfell in the books, so anyway, whoever this guy is, his name is literally like Horseman. I'm trying to make an intelligent guess here. All 3 of the older boys rode ahead of him, with Rob looking over his shoulder every few moments to check on him. Really, Rob? The horseman. Harwin was behind all of them. He wanted to ride up there with them, but he was still growing accustomed to riding a real horse, and when the boys were without his father, they tended to turn to the men's talk, which he wasn't all too interested in. The men's talk. So actually, I'm going to pause here and make a few comments. So number 1, if you've noticed, between the first episode and this episode, there have been quite a few mentions of John failing like certain things and having like certain symptoms. This is a common thing that comes up throughout it that has to do with a plot point that I don't want to explain just yet, if only because when we read the 3 Dany chapters that I have in here, we'll get to talk about it more, sort of. I feel like I'm spoiling it, but at the same time, I feel like if we don't all know this, whether because you figured it out from the books or the show, you're kind of behind the times, but we'll talk about that more later. Secondly, note here that the whole a boy of 10 thing happens and Bran gets all nervous and stuff. It's the reason for that. If I sound like I'm talking really slow and I sound tired, it's because it's 8 in the morning. So, moving on. Once they passed the walls, they rode past the taverns and shops and homes in the winter town. Theon called out to the girls standing outside of the bedhouse before he whispered something to Rob, then went off to its front to speak to a woman with orange-brown hair. He didn't know why. It was far too early in the day for that kind of thing. He urged his horse a bit closer when he returned. Roz is leaving for the south, Theon said in an exasperated tone. What could she want down there, John said. She said she was going to a house in King's Landing, Theon told him. Rob chuckled. Must have gotten a taste for royal blood, he said in a lowered voice. He looked over his shoulder again. Bran turned his head as if he hadn't heard. They lowered their voices further, and the rest of the conversation was lost on him. He didn't mind a bit. Nice little plot point to just kind of throw that in there for us. I guess it kind of makes sense to have that happen there, because where else would you hear about it? Though Theon is a POV character, but I don't know if that happening would merit its own chapter. But yeah, definitely take note of how many show elements are showing up in these different versions. This was very inspired by the show early on, and not in the least because I hadn't read the books yet. I'd owned a Game of Thrones back then, but I hadn't read it all the way. So even though I was super interested in like this world and this story, I never delved into the source material. So a lot of what I know, or what I knew about it, was from the books and then my own assumptions, which is how you get things like Aegon the Conqueror being the one who brought the Seven to Westeros and not the Andals. But anyway, moving on. Once they left the reaches of the town, they were met by the great grasses that thrived in the north. They kept north for a while, soon closing in on the forest. The wolves slinked off into the trees. Rob called for them to follow. They rode the beaten path into the wood, the one he knew led through to deep-wood motte in its depths. He tried to look for the wolves, but they seemed to have disappeared into the underbrush. After only a while, the older boy stopped. They all began to dismount their horses. "Can I go a bit further?" he said to Rob. He wasn't ready to finish just yet, and he wanted to get used to his horse. Rob hesitated a moment, but then nodded. "Don't go too far. Don't go off the path." "I won't," he promised, and pushed his horse back on her way. "Do you think he'll name his horse?" he heard Theon say behind him. "He'll get to it eventually," Rob told him. "Hasn't even been a day. It's been a month and he hadn't even named his wolf." Their voices grew quieter as he moved away. He didn't hear if Rob replied. It was true. He hadn't been able to name his wolf. Nothing seemed to fit him. He felt a pang in his chest at the thought of him. He looked down at the horse beneath him. She was a young filly with a white coat dappled in gray spots. She was graceful and steady. Quite the horse. But, as Theon thought, he couldn't think of a name. "I'll get to it eventually," he echoed in his head. It hasn't even been a day. There's got to be something thematically relevant about the fact that Bran can't name any of his animals. Something is going on there. And not my brain can't connect it right now because it's early in the morning. But there's definitely something going on there that says something about the character. He stopped his horse after a short while, wanting to heed Rob's words. He hoped he hadn't gone too far. When he turned around, he couldn't see the boys back in the other direction. He thought he should go back, just in case. He had gone to push her back when he was distracted by a rustling in the brush. He turned back, expecting his wolf or one of the others, but the eyes that met him were human. I think it's worth noting that, at least as far as I know in the show, again, it's been a while since I've actually read a Game of Thrones, but as far as I can remember in the show, Bran snuck off and rode his horse by himself when Rob and Theon were just kind of talking to each other and arguing. So it is interesting here that Rob tells Bran that he can just go, because it seems like the kind of thing that they would don't go off into the wolf's wood by yourself, because he doesn't have his wolf. Also, now I'm wondering if this came from the same version of the story that at least the second of the Joffrey chapters came from, because of the whole missing wolf thing. A man stepped from behind a tree, thin and dirty and pale and worn-looking leathers and skins. Another man appeared behind him, taller and stronger looking. Neither of them looked as if they'd had a proper meal recently. "You lost, boy?" the first man said. "No," he answered back honestly. "What's a boy like you doing out here all alone?" another voice said. This one was female, however. He turned his head to find 3 women emerging from the brush. All had worn clothing and an underfed look like the men. One with a dark tangle of hair carried a spear in her hand. "I'm not alone," he answered honestly again. Silently, in his head, he hoped that his brother or Theon or Harwin would appear, having come to see where he was. "Look alone to me," the first man said. "That's a fine horse," one of the women said. When he looked at her, she looked more like a girl, no older than his brothers, if that. Her hair was bright fiery orange despite its limp appearance, and she had prominent buck teeth. Only a lord could get a horse like that. I wonder who that is." "I don't know," the third woman said. "We could get a horse like that if we want." He caught the hungry look in her eyes under her shaggy white blonde hair. He didn't like these people a bit. It didn't seem forestmen or lumberers or even northerners at all. They had heavy accents that he didn't recognize. He wondered where these people had come from. "Bran, leave." "Lad," the first man said to him, "you ought to get off the horse." "No." They wouldn't have it, he thought. He only just got her. He hadn't even named her. Bran. "I haven't named my horse. You can't have it." "Look, son," the third woman said to him, pulling a knife from her waist. "You get from that horse and you don't get hurt here." "No," he said again. They all looked at each other. The fire-haired girl grabbed his horse's reins. He wished he had thought the same. "Well, it'd be a shame to hurt a child, wouldn't it?" she said to the others. She turned back to him. "Just get from that horse, boy." "No, I'm Bran of House Stark, and I'll see your corpses before I leave this horse's back." The other stepped back a bit. "Oh, excuse me," the blonde woman said. "We didn't know we was dealing with a lord." Not that I like these wildings, but also that line is mood. The fire-haired girl laughed. That's probably the strongest thing you've ever said, ain't it? He felt his face grow hot. He didn't like to be mocked. How old are you, my lord? He gritted his teeth. 10. A boy is 10, the man said. Bran's eyes grew wide at the mention of the words. He felt his breathing grow quicker as well. The man gave him a look and then turned to the girl. Them strong words for a boy of 10. He ain't lying, though. Look at them spots on his neck, the tangle-haired woman said, pointing at him. He's one of them. He don't got the eyes, though, the fire-haired girl said, looking into his face. Don't they got those gray eyes? Heard sometimes they have black, too, the first man said. Why do they know this? Like, I know that the Starks, like, are known, but it's really weird that, like, I guess the people have come to the wall. I don't know. Anyway, the second man finally spoke. His voice was much deeper than the other man's. His eyes was blue. His wife is one of them Southerners, this blonde woman said. I don't remember which one. My mother is Catelyn of House Tully, he said as indignantly as he could with his shaking voice. Ain't he something? The first man said. They're so rude. Imagine what the king beyond the wall would take for one of the Starks, the tangle-haired woman said, and alive, too. He's too young, the fire-haired girl said. Too young for what? What the fuck? He wouldn't keep till that far, the blonde woman said. We barely kept till that far. We already lost one. I don't know what that guy's name was. Steer. Steer was half mad as it was. The tangle-haired woman answered back. That's why he ain't got a head no more. Oh, I think that was his name. Or Will. I'm not sure. Anyway, moving on. Bran remembered the man that his father had executed at Deepwood Mott. They were wildings, like he was. He panicked then. Let go of my horse! Take him from that horse, the first man said to the fire-haired girl. Take your hands off him, he heard Jon say. He'd never been so relieved in his life. The elder boy's black eyes were burning, and he had his sword in hand. What's this, another Stark boy? A brother, the tangle-haired woman said. There's one of you and 5 of us, boy, the first man said to him. You set down that sword and get off that horse. You and your brother will be on your way. I'm Jon Snow of House Stark, and if you so much as scratch my brother, I'll see that you die screaming. All right, Daenerys. How are you a Stark if your name's Snow, boy? Why are we discussing this? There's a lot of really unnecessary conversation in this chapter. He's a bastard, the blonde woman said. That's what they call them down here. I ain't scared of no bastard, even Starks, the man said. We'll take both their horses then. Jon let out a whistle, which was followed by the sound of rustling through the brush. Ghost appeared first, then Grey Wind, and Mordred after. All 3 were snarling, baring their impressive teeth. None of their wolves were full-grown, but they were all the size of a full-grown wolf of regular proportions. All of the wildings tensed. The boy's got dire wolves at his call, the blonde woman gasped. The man scoffed. They'd just be dogs. We'll take them all. Everything happened in a flash. The wildings pulled out their weapons, and then Jon and the wolves were on them. Bran let out a yelp as the fire-haired girl tried to pull him from his saddle. Jon rode by and grabbed her by the arm, pulling her off forcefully. His filly bucked when one of the wolves darted beneath her. He was falling before he could grab her reins. He heard Robb yell as his vision went black. He awoke to a rough tongue licking his face. Bloody hell, he heard Theon say, sounding winded. He's back. At first he thought Theon meant him, but then he opened his eyes. Yellow were the ones that he met first, then Theon's sea green. It was his wolf that was licking his face, his dark brown fur looking damp. There was a cut above Theon's eyebrow that bled down across his face, a dry trail going over his nose and under his other eye. Bran bolted upright. Not so quick, you, Harwin said from behind him. They weren't on the trail anymore. They weren't in the forest at all. They were back on the King's Road again. He saw Robb staring at him, his hair disheveled and a bruise purpling on his neck, obscuring his freckles. Grey Wind was by his side, muzzle covered in blood. Mordred was laying on the ground a few feet away, his mouth wet with blood as well. The wilding woman with the tangled hair was standing by him, hands tied and a slash in her arm. But something was off, he thought as he surveyed his surroundings. Something was missing. He looked over to Theon. Where's Jon? That's the end of the chapter. What? So, that was a chapter. I felt like this chapter was going somewhere, but then it kind of like got off track with all of the conversation between Bran and the Wildings. It just feels really weird that the Wildings took like 7 years to discuss everything. But they're like, oh, he's a Stark, but no, he can't be a Stark. His eyes aren't the wrong color. And it's like, who gives a flying fuck? It doesn't matter. Like, but outside of that stuff, if you kind of chopped out the fat of that stuff, this chapter wouldn't have been that bad. It reads like all of the other ones that we've read, which is fine with me. Excuse the fucking trash truck outside, even though it's fucking Tuesday, because yesterday was Memorial Day. Anyway, it reads like the other chapters, which is perfectly fine because that's definitely a readable type of writing. One thing I will say about reading this is that I'm starting to get a sense of the way that I wrote before I really got into my 2013 style of writing. When we get to Batman, you'll see a lot more of this, especially Batman Begins. But yeah, it's definitely an interesting turn of events. 1 minute, let me close my fucking window. Anyway, one thing I do wonder about this, though, is how plausible it is that John would have gotten kidnapped when, like, yes, they were outnumbered and there were fewer Starks than there were Wildings, but, like, with the wolves and everything and the fact that it was such a close quarters fight, how the hell did the Wildings that did survive manage to get away with John when all these other people were there? That's what I am curious about, but it's just logistics. So, let's move on to the next chapter, which is a Theon chapter. It's all a bloody mess, Theon said as he dropped into the chair. Rob nodded in agreement. Just in the eve, Lady Stark left for King's Landing, telling them that her sister Lysa of the Arryns suspected that her husband's death was a murder. Stop name-dropping, just say Lysa. The searches for John and Ghost had come up fruitless. Osha, the Wilding woman, had nothing to tell them. His favorite bedmate had left for the splendors of the south, and just now Robb had told him that the body of Sansa's wolf had arrived to be buried in the Godswood so that Lord Jaime might not have her pelt, and Nymeria had gone missing as well. I'm sending out another party, Robb said quietly. I want him found. I know, Theon agreed. He knew that if they didn't find him soon, the Wildings will have had enough time to get him to the wall. After that, there was no hope. He was still surprised that the two had gotten away. Yeah, me too, Theon. The wolves had gotten to two of them and torn them to pieces, and Robb gave Osha the scar on her arm. Under normal circumstances, he'd have been impressed, but not when his friend was their hostage. Fair. So a few things. Number one, the name dropping here. I keep complaining about it. However, it is necessary to an extent because a thing that was pretty prominent in prophs back when it was supposed to be prose is the fact that all of the chapters were meant to be from the POV of the children. So it wasn't really so much an age limit. Certain people just were kind of closed out of being POVs. So that's why you'll see a lot of chapters that were from the POV of like Ned, Cat, or Tyrion in the book be from the point of view of their kids or nephews in the case of Tyrion and stuff like that. Similarly here, because Cat isn't a POV and neither is Ned, we constantly have to name drop her sister Lysa and what house she belongs to, because otherwise there's really no way to get that information casually. At the same time, though, I do feel like this could have been solved by having a chapter where the kids find out that Jon Arryn died, or just like something like that, because I think that's something that happened in a later version and it works decently. I don't know, it just is weird to keep reading all these things and it's like, oh yeah, her sister Lysa Arryn, and it's like, why would Theon think that? He knows who her sister is, you know? It's less egregious because at least this is supposed to be in Theon's head than the other version of this chapter where Kat literally says that out loud. Like, they don't know who her sister is, but anyway. There was a knock on the door. Robb beckoned them inside the sitting room. It was Maester Aemon. My lord, he said, bowing to Robb shortly. There's been a message. Just to note that in this, for some reason, Maester Aemon was turned into the equivalent of a septon. I don't know why I did that, but I think that kind of speaks to my lack of knowledge about the books, that I just thought, like, giving Maester Aemon and Septim Ordained similar titles was okay. They even have similar names. It's, like, weird. Not now, Maester. I'll see it later. It's for Lord Theon. Theon looked up. What does it say? Who is it from? It's a request for your presence on Dragonstone, my lord. From Lord Baratheon? Robb asked him. The maester shook his head. That's just it, my lord. We don't know who it's from. It came with a man riding a labor in pitch-black armor. He gave us no name. He didn't say a thing except that it was for Lord Theon. He and Robb looked at each other, then back at the maester. Why, if I hadn't held the paper in my own hands, I think I was losing my mind, my lord. What? Theon rose from his chair. I want to see this message for myself. I thought you would ask, the maester said, pulling it from his robes. It was a plain-looking envelope containing a plain-looking letter, both in plain white paper. The letter only read, requesting the presence of Lord Theon Greyjoy on the island of Dragonstone, just like the maester said. It was wholly unremarkable, save for a black dot with a circle drawn around it in the corner that he'd missed before. What's this? He said, pointing to it. The maester squinted at it. That's the sign of R'hllor, but why would that... He trailed off in thought, then his eyes widened in recognition. Ah, Lady Melisandre. Who? She gives counsel to Lord Baratheon. She's a priestess of R'hllor. Isn't he of the Seven? Robb asked. Not anymore, not since she's come. But what could she want with you? Robb said. Theon shrugged. I don't know. He turned back to the maester. Send a message back saying that I'm occupied. I'm not stepping a foot off the grounds until Jon is back. Of course, my lord. Theon headed for the door. Where are you going? Robb asked him. The gods would. Why? To pray. So let me pause right here. First things first, I have no idea what this plotline was supposed to lead to. However, I do distinctly remember there being an entire thing in old prophs where Theon was supposed to, do something with Melisandre in some way, shape, or form. And I think there was actually going to be a romance happening there. I don't know why. I really cannot for the life of me think of what exactly was the point of that plot line, but it was a thing for a long time. That part of the chapter seems really out of place because it's like this whole conversation about he has this letter. Well, who's it from? Oh, is it from Stannis? No. Well, then who? Also, I mean, Melisandre is like a stunt queen. What the fuck? Why would she send a dude in black armor on a black lizard horse to do that? Why? Why can't she just send a raven like a normal person? Anyway, he made his way back up the stairs and out to the Godswood, which stood as spectacular in night as it did in day. It was almost like the moon's meager gray light turned white when it hit the leaves here. Lord Stark had told him it was always a light by the power of the old gods. He hoped it were true tonight. Mordred joined him when he made it to the heart tree, the wolf black as the shadows he'd been named for. His icy blue eyes shined in the moonlight. He kneeled down by the pool and the wolf sat next to him. Maybe I should have named the wolf Shadow. Whatever. He didn't really know what to do. He'd never prayed before. He bowed his head and just thought. Bring Jon back, he thought, and let them not find Nymeria. Let her run, or bring her back here too. Let nothing happen to Lord Stark or Arya or Sansa or even Lady Catelyn. Bring them all back here if you have to. The wind blew above him, whistling past the big trunk of the heart tree. It's interesting that this is happening in a Theon chapter and not in a Bran chapter, because this seems like something that would happen with Bran. But moving on. You hear them, my lord? Someone asked him. Literally, I think this happened in a Bran chapter in the books. He looked up to find Osha staring back at him from the other side. Her hair was still as tangled as it wanted to be, but not nearly as bad as when they'd first brought her. Hear what? He said as he got back to his feet. The gods. That was just the wind. They make the wind, my lord, she said, getting to her feet. What are you doing out here? They let me pray when I need it. We keep the old gods above the wall, too, my lord. I don't keep them, he told her honestly. I don't keep any gods. And what are you doing praying in the godswood? Who are you praying to, my lord? It's none of your business, he said dismissively. Back in the castle with you. As you say, my lord, she said with a bow. He watched her as he went. It was true. He didn't keep any gods. He'd never taken to the old gods or the Seven, nor the god of his father and the Ironborn. He never thought them real before, but he hoped he might be wrong tonight. He hoped someone might have heard him. The sound of footsteps caused him to look up. This time it was Robb and Grey One coming towards him. Did you see they buried her behind the tree? Robb said to him. He looked around the side and saw a patch of earth dug and refilled. The sap from the tree was already making its way toward it, the red liquid crawling slowly along the ground. What's gotten into you? Robb said when he turned back. It's not what's gotten into me so much as what's gotten away from me, he said. What's gotten away from us, Robb corrected. He looked into the pool. The water turned blue in the night. It felt like everything had gotten away from them. You don't think they'll get above the wall, do you? He asked. No, I can't afford to, Robb told him. In just a few weeks, Robb had gone from a fun-loving boy to a hard-faced man. He looked more than his 18 years. You accept loss when it happens, not before, or you're just bringing it on yourself. Your father tell you that, Stark? Theon asked. In just a few seconds, he was back to that boy, playfully hitting him on the shoulder. They both laughed for the first time in a while. When they went quiet, the silence seemed to close in on them. There wasn't the sound of birds or insects or a thing. He has my dagger, Robb said quietly. Theon looked at him. He does? Robb nodded. He'd asked to see it, remember? He looked out of the gates toward the yard and the gates of the grounds beyond. Maybe it'll do him some good. And that is where that chapter ends. Alright, so I would say that everything outside of the Melisandre stuff in this chapter is actually really, really good. One thing you will notice as we read through different versions of prophs, as we're going through this fanfic reread project process, This chapter and like similar chapters to it will pop up in almost every single version of prophs, which I think says something about what it represents in Theon's story. And I do think this is like a really good chapter, and it says a lot about the character. But yeah, this is similar to the Theon chapter that we read in the first episode. And I will say that the way that this one introduces the concept of Theon going to the Godswood and it being shocking actually works better than the other one, because it doesn't lampshade it at all. And I love the way that the chapter ends. The conversation that he has with Robb here is actually really nice. Overall, I think this chapter was actually pretty decent. Like, the second half of it was definitely better than the first. And even the parts where it, like, sort of took on the elements of a Bran chapter, I didn't really mind, because given, like, the character's status in the story, it makes sense. So, let's move on. Now we have a Jon chapter. Don't know why you don't just sell the damn thing. I already told you, he said through gritted teeth. It's my brother's. He turned the blade over in his hands, flinching as the sun glinted off the purple glass. Well, your brother ain't here, Ygritte said to him. I'm aware, Wilding. I intend to give it back to him, he said defiantly. Besides, the only man in the north that could afford the thing besides my father is Roose Bolton, and the last thing the Dreadfort needs is more blades. He wouldn't let anyone have his brother's dagger, not a soul. They'd already taken his sword. He wouldn't let them have the dagger. I don't know what any of that means, Ygritte said. And don't call me that. Wilding, she said, spitting on the ground. We ain't wild, we free. And we're not slaves, Jon told her. Yeah, but you ain't free, she said, turning around. You got kings and lords and whatnot, always kneeling, you all. Kneel for the king, kneel for your lord. You have a king. He only calls himself that. She turned back. We don't kneel for no one. He'd heard stories about the king beyond the wall. He lived in the haunted forest, and he ate women that the wildings brought him from below the walls so that they wouldn't get eaten themselves. He'd heard that he had gray skin and pointed teeth and webbed fingers. That didn't sound like a man you didn't kneel to. Of course, those were just stories, like the ones Arya always told Bran. He was probably just a man, like the rest of them. That guy sounds a little less like Mance Rayder and a little more like the Night King. I mean, even the Night King doesn't have webbed fingers, but... They'd walk day and night, barely resting so that they might reach the wall before someone found him and took him back. He turned the dagger over in his hands again. He could kill both of them right now, Ygritte and Rhaor. The dragon glass could slice through their flesh like a hot knife through butter, but they were so far that he wouldn't even begin to know where to go. He wondered why Ghost hadn't done it when he'd shown back up. It was like he must have known. They must have been close to it now. He didn't know where they were, and it'd been weeks. He wished that someone would show up, anyone at all, even Robb himself or Theon. He didn't want to be out in the middle of nowhere with wildings, so battered that he didn't know what marks they were born with and what were bruises and scars. He wanted back to Winterfell. All he'd known about the wildings he heard from stories, and so far they were only half wrong. They didn't steal women. They stole anyone they could get their hands on. Ygritte was just as loud and wild as they said, but Rhaor was silent as a stone most of the time. The stories never said about how the king beyond the wall took slaves. No wonder the wildings took people from the north, he thought. They wouldn't be so free if they didn't. We're gonna have to stop soon, Ygritte said. The sky above them was turning bloody red with sunset. He knew he wasn't going to eat tonight because they hadn't caught anything. His frame had grown smaller from the lack of proper meals. Maybe Ghost would bring something tonight. Sometimes he caught things and he never let the others touch it. The wolf was getting thinner too. They camped by the waters of the Bay of Ice, the stars and moon sparkling in the black waters. Ghost came back from the woods with an empty jaw. Their fire was small. Most of the wood had been wet because of the snow. It worked fine for him despite the size. As he gazed into the flame, he thought of his family. How were his father and his sisters? They must have made it to King's Landing by now, or very close. He wondered if Bran had closed himself in his room again, or if Rickon had taken the crying again. I didn't know Rickon existed in this version. What about Theon and all the wolves and there's nothing after that and, I guess Robb. It was maddening not knowing what was going on. What if something happened to his father, or his sisters, or Theon? What if something happened to Robb? He hissed at a pain in his hand. He looked down to find a cut in his palm, blood beading up along the thin line. His blood was on the dagger as well, painting the sharp edge red. He brought his hand to his mouth and licked the slash. His blood was copper on his tongue. "Hey, what are you doing?" Ygritte asked him. He ignored her and put the blade in his belt. Sleep didn't come as easily as he wished. He curled up with Ghost, but he was still cold. At least the cut won't fester. It was far too cold for that. I don't think that's how that works, but all right. He could hear Ygritte snoring loudly behind him. He dug his face into the wolf's neck and squeezed his eyes shut. Sleep would be a blessing now. So I'm just going to pause here real quick to give a warning for the next part, because there is a very sort of somewhat casual conversation of what is essentially rape. I don't know why this is in here, but it's in here and I need to warn you guys about it because I don't want to read that and then be like, oh shit, sorry, I'll Photoshop it in later. So, moving on. He awoke with this. Even my brain doesn't want me to read this. He awoke with a start the next morning. He squinted hard against the searing sunlight, his eyelids becoming sore quickly. The cut on his hand pounded. He rubbed at his aching eyes and then yelped when he felt a foot in his back. Up with you, Vigreet shouted at him. Ghost rose from the ground and growled at her. Easy, boy, he said to the wolf. Don't kick me, he said as he got up. They trekked through the forest for most of the day. He wondered if this was the Wolf's Wood. He knew it went far, but they went so far around it at first that they had passed the headwaters of the White Knife and the Last River and the Dreadfort. He didn't know, and he could barely think. The sun had been giving him a lasting headache. This is the part. You're lucky it's just kicking, Ygritte said to him in a lowered voice. You're a hostage. You're lucky Rhaeor don't run into you in the nights. But that's just 'cause you're going to the king beyond the wall. He doesn't run into you, Jon said tightly. Do I look like a hostage? She smiled. Besides, he don't like the women. He don't. He only take boys. Rhaegar barked something at her in their rough tongue, and she turned back, saying something back. He felt like his stomach had folded in on itself. They've never mentioned that in the stories. Yeah, me too, Jon. It wasn't until sunset that they came out of the forest again. This time they weren't met by the bay or a field. This time they met a giant mountain, shadowed by the sun behind it. The thing was all white, not the black or brown or grays of a regular mountain, all its peaks made of slippery-looking white ice. An arch had been carved out of the ice at its foot, and under it sat a canyon that dug into the ground. Off in the distance he could see more peaks continuing on for what seemed like forever. They'd made it, the wall and the gorge. The shadow tower loomed ahead of them as well, black as a shadow against the white. He and Ghost could run now, go back into the forest and see if they could follow it back home. Rhaegar grabbed him by the arm before he could make any moves. He heard Ghost let out a small whimper as they dragged him towards the gorge. Come on, boy, Rhaegar said in his deep, rasping voice. It's time you went beyond the wall. And that's the end of that chapter. So, if you cut out the part, this has been a very common complaint, but if you cut out the little part where Ygritte threatens Jon with like, oh, you're lucky you don't get raped, like, I really don't know the point of that. Like, sure, she might just be trying to scare him and freak him out because, oh, he's from the South. Homophobics, they're from the South. But it still is just, like, completely, like, it's not funny. Which it's not, I don't think it's supposed to be, but it's still, like, what is the point of having that there, But if you ignore that, the rest of the chapter is not that bad. There's a lot of world building. Yeah, you kind of learn a lot more about the geography of the North. This chapter managed to hold my attention all the way through, despite the fact that Jon doesn't have much dialogue in it. It's mostly just his thoughts. The conversations that he does have with Ygritte, barring the one, are for the most part pretty interesting and teach you some stuff about the wildings. Shit, I was about to say something, but I forgot. Fuck. But I think what's interesting with this chapter is some of the foreshadowing to Jon's Targaryen heritage. I guess we can just talk about that now, because it's not really a spoiler thanks to the show. So I think in particular, the part where Jon is sitting by the fire and thinking about his family, and he's holding the dagger, and then he's like staring into the fire, and then he cuts himself, and now he's bleeding, and it's like, oh, fire and blood. On top of the fact that it is a dagger made of dragon glass and it's purple like the Targaryen's eyes are supposed to be. Though I don't think that was actually a thing in this. I don't know why the blade of the dagger was purple in this, but it was. But that was like a whole thing. There are more elements to that, but again, we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to the Dany chapter. But yeah, this wasn't completely terrible. So let's move on to the last chapter from this batch, which is another Bran chapter. The air outside was cool on his face, hitting him hard as the wind whipped by. He could feel the water in the air, though it wasn't raining, or at least not yet. The clouds roiled above him, a swirling mass of black and gray. Strange weather, he thought. The yard was incredibly empty around him. There weren't any dogs or horses or people or anything. It was so quiet. The sound of dirt crunching under his feet played loud in his ears. He stopped. This was too strange. Where was everyone? Where were all the animals? He moved back to the castle. The sounds of the doors creaking open echoed through an empty hall. Hello? He called out. His voice echoed the same way. Where were all the servants? As he moved further inwards, the door shut behind him, the sound loud and sudden across the walls. He gasped and turned around. Just the wind, he told himself. He whipped his head around at the sound of whispering, but it disappeared just as soon as it appeared. He decided that there was nothing else in there for him, so he went back to the yard. It was just as empty as it had been before. There was no way the entire grounds could be deserted save for him. There had to be someone. He could climb to see what he might. From the roofs he could see anything that was happening, if anything was happening at all. He started towards the burn tower, the highest one he could climb. As he walked towards it, he finally ran into another living being, his wolf. But there was something wrong. He was still a pup. He knew the dark brown fur and the bright yellow eyes, but he was a third of the size he ought to be. When he started to approach it, he ran off. "Where are you going, boy?" he shouted after him, but he kept going. Begrudgingly, he resumed his trek towards the tower. What in the world was going on? The further he went, the more he was filled with a strange feeling. Hadn't he done this before? Gone this way? It must not have been recently, since he couldn't remember, but didn't something happen over here? He pushed the questions from his mind when he reached the tower's wall. He looked up to the top. It seemed taller, like it reached right up to the center of that swirling mass of clouds. He started up it anyway. Some of the bricks stuck out further than the rest, making good hand and footholds. That's why he loved climbing this tower so much. About halfway, he moved from the bricks to the thick ivy that climbed up the side. It was surprisingly sturdy. Why, don't climb on plants, Bran. He stopped to rest a moment, grabbing hold of an old flagpole. It was a piece of wood about 5 inches on all sides that stuck out horizontally from the wall, with another underneath it connecting the two diagonally. Why did we need an in-depth description of that? It was a perfect place for a moment's sit. The wind whistled past him as he looked out over the grounds. There was nothing he could see from here. He would be able to see even better from the top. He looked over his shoulder when he heard a noise behind him. That was strange. The only thing up there was crows, and it didn't sound like crows. He spied the window in the wall. It seemed like it was coming from up there. He looked down when he heard another sound. His pup looked back at him. That feeling filled him again. This had definitely happened before, too. Why couldn't he remember it properly? He pushed the questions from his mind again and eased himself from his perch, facing the side towards the window. He wanted to see what was going on in there. He took to the ivy again as it reached right to the sill. The noise got louder as he inched closer. It sounded like crying. He stopped abruptly. He definitely remembered that, and it didn't make him feel good. Okay, so another warning for sexual assault here. He decided he ought to keep towards the window anyway. What if something was wrong? What if someone needed help? He didn't know what he could do from all the way up there. He glanced down again and saw his pup still down there, still small, still staring back up at him. For a moment, he thought the pup looked worried, but that was impossible. He was just an animal. He followed the ivy right up to the sill. He didn't know if he should pull himself up or not. He didn't know who was up there. He moved up beside it and leaned over just so he could see inside. There were 2 people in there, a man and a woman. He couldn't see either properly. The man had the woman pushed up against the wall. It was her sobs that he'd heard from his perch. Why was that man hurting her? He didn't know who either of these people was, since all he could see was their hair, bright red and gold. He was hit with that feeling again, even harder this time. He felt his stomach drop, but he still didn't know why. He knew he ought to go, however. He tried to go back, but his legs wouldn't take him. Oh, no, Bran. He looked down at himself in bewilderment. What was going on? He looked back into the room. That poor woman was still sobbing as the man slowly began to lower himself to the ground. He recognized the woman's face as soon as he saw it. The queen. She opened her eyes, the green all darkened and the whites all red from her tears. Hers widened just as his did. She started to scream. He felt himself begin to panic. He moved to the ivy as quick as he could, but an arm grabbed his shirt and stopped him. The wind blew hard as the arm pulled him back to the window. Thunder rumbled across the sky as he came face to face with the man. Lord Jamie stared at him, his eyes angry black where they should have been green. "Let him go," he heard the queen say behind him. "Please, please, please." Her words dissolved in the sobs. He didn't know what to do. He kept both hands on the edge of the window, digging one into the stone as much as he could, and the other firmly gripped on a vine. The lord looked at the queen behind him and then back. "How old are you, boy?" he asked him. 10, his mouth answered involuntarily. Thunder rolled across the sky again, and when he looked up, it looked like the clouds were spinning faster. "A boy of 10, the lord hissed. At the sound of the words, everything came back to him. The climb, the sounds, the pup, it all came rushing back with frightening speed. He began to struggle against the lord's grip. "No!" he screamed. The lord looked from him to the queen again. "Things I do for love," he spat. He let go of his shirt and shoved a hand into his chest. This time, things happened differently. This time, he didn't catch himself on a brick, banging his chin as he did. This time, he wasn't able to scramble up the vines and out of the Lord's reach. This time, he didn't make it to the remains of the roof. This time, both of his hands slipped and he tumbled backwards into open air as the queen's screams echoed above him, turning to shrill screeches that vibrated the air. The clouds swirled and the lightning flashed. He screamed, knowing that he would meet the ground and shatter. The world went black just before the impact. Bran opened his eyes to find himself in his room. Rickon was staring at him, as well as Shaggy, Dog, and his own wolf. They were both the size they should have been this time. He realized that his breathing was heavy, and then that Osha was at the door staring at him as well. "Boy," she said in her rough accent, "you seeing some things." "What happened?" he heard Rob say from behind the wall. "Mustn't tell," his mind told him quickly. "Mustn't tell." "Nothing," he rushed to answer. "It was just a dream." And that's the end of that chapter. So, unlike the other chapter, the offending content actually needed to be here because it actually happened. So, that was pretty fucking good. This chapter always catches me by surprise. Again, it reads the same way as all of the other chapters, but I think the way that this approaches the Bran's dream chapter is another really interesting thing, especially because it is so far outside of anything that happened in the books at all. Part of the reason why this chapter exists, because I do realize that in the book, this literally happened as a Bran chapter earlier on when it actually happened. However, and this is something that you will see later on, like later on when we get to Prophs 2.0, that Bran chapter is an Arya chapter in the book, so you don't actually see the event as it happens, you only see the aftermath. This chapter existed to fill in the blanks after a few chapters of you seeing how Bran reacted to the incident, which is very interesting because it takes a lot of the stuff, like you can guess what happened based off of what happened in the books, but it puts a lot of why Bran is acting the way he is into context. The reason why he keeps getting triggered by the phrase "a boy of 10," why he's not going south despite the fact that, as we learned in this version, he actually didn't fall from the tower. And like just everything that's been happening, and it's like, oh, okay, so this is exactly what he saw and what happened, you know? But yeah, this chapter is actually really good. I would say this batch of chapters overall has been pretty decent. It's like the same quality as the stuff that we had been reading, but definitely better than some of the earlier stuff that we were reading. Though I will say that Jon chapter wasn't bad that we read in the first episode. So I'm gonna stop it here because after this we get to the Dany chapters, which should be read all together and kind of don't have any context with the other stuff. So if you like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you next episode when we read the Dany chapters, and I think that'll be the last episode for this section. So I'll see you then. Bye.